talk about the case for Honduras and ending arms sales to Honduras. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. And the last session I did way too much background, so when I start talking too much, just tell me I'm talking too much and we'll move on to the case itself. You have to hold me accountable, okay? One thing that's interesting, so the way I started off the last session, and I think it's important to say for this one as well, is that when we're comparatively speaking, arms sales to Central America are not as big as they are to other places in the world. So you're going to learn Saudi Arabia, to Israel, to Japan. We send a lot of weapons and arms to these countries. Comparatively speaking, we don't send nearly as much to Central America. But the reason that Central America is important and why it's a little bit different is that Central America is what we consider to be the United States' backyard. It's walking distance in some cases. When I lived in San Diego, I went across the border to Mexico every weekend. People from Central America can literally walk up to the United States. And because of this proximity, the United States has a special interest in the region. And so what's important to understand is that the United States, going back years and years and years, has felt that it's important to more or less dominate this region. In 1823, we established what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. So the reason it's important to know the Monroe Doctrine is basically America said to everyone else in the world, hands off. The Americas, the Central America region, the South America region, that's ours. You can do a little business there, you can come if we allow you to, but if you're not invited, you're not welcome. And that was especially to the Europeans, right? The Europeans had colonized a lot of the world at this point in time. They had a lot of interest in other places, such as Africa, Asia. But the United States basically said, this is our region. And this has continued up until present day. And even recent history, only a couple decades ago, we did some really questionable things in the region to continue to emphasize our dominance there. So there were civil wars in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in the 70s and 80s, and we got involved. And part of that involved us sending weapons to certain parties, so to help one side win over the other. And a lot of bad things happened. And a lot of the instability that you see in the region can be traced back to this time. And we continue to meddle in the affairs of the Americas. Now, some people would say it's vital for national security interests, which you won't get argument from me. There is definitely a part of that. And then other times, the United States does some things that are a little bit more questionable. And so the country we're going to focus on is Honduras. Honduras is do we have a map in here? No, okay, but so you have Mexico, Guatemala, and then Honduras, essentially. So it's pretty darn close to the United States. And we've been interested in Honduran politics for quite a while. And one of the most recent important points to remember, not the most important point, but one of the most important ones to remember, is that in 2009, a democratically elected president was ousted from his presidency. He was said to not be eligible to run for presidential election because the Constitution of Honduras said you can only run for one term, and he was running for a second term. So you had this tension between the Honduran people saying, we want this man, Manuel Zelaya, to be president again, but then you have the courts and the rule of law justice system saying it's actually illegal for him to do so. The United States sided with the law over the people, and Manuel Zelaya was ousted as president of Honduras. The man that replaced him was named Juan Orlando Hernandez. Now, Zelaya was on the left end of the spectrum. So he was someone who believed in redistribution of wealth, helping poor people, really focusing on what we would typically connect to in the United States, the Democratic Party, okay? And it's not a perfect comparison, but just to help us understand a little bit. Juan Orlando Hernandez, on the other hand, is a conservative. Cares more about business, making sure business opportunities are open, socially has more conservative ideas, religious. And he became president, and then in 2017, his presidency was supposed to end. Now, In 2017, he did exactly what the guy did in 2009 and said, I'm not leaving, I'm going to be president again, even though the Constitution said he was not allowed to. Now, during that election, he probably should have lost, but there was massive voter fraud. All the computers that tallied all the votes went down for 24 hours. So he was losing the election, and the computers went down for 24 hours, and when they came back up, he was winning. How did this happen? This is crazy. The Organization of American States, which monitors elections in the Americas, it's based here in Washington, D.C., said this was entirely fraudulent. This was clearly illegal. There were irregularities throughout this election process. But the United States didn't really say anything. The United States wasn't, just like in 2009 when they were like, yeah, we're okay with this transition, they kind of did the same thing again. Now, what happened was, people in Honduras were upset. They thought they had elected a new president. It seemed that the new president was winning. The computers go down, and then they pop back up, and you have Juan Orlando Hernandez winning. You have the guy who shouldn't even have been allowed to win, winning in a way that looked really fishy to a lot of people. So you had protesters take to the street. And for days, you had people burning, flipping cars, protesting, saying this is illegal, this shouldn't happen. And in that fighting, some of the protesters got killed. And what's really important to know is that the pictures of the military, the Honduran military that was trying to suppress the protest were pictured with a certain type of gun. And that gun could have only come from one place. Which one?
The military grade A, or the M4.
The M4. Exactly. So they were pictured with this particular type of weapon called an M4 that they weren't even supposed to have. Earlier in the year, the United States had sold M4s to Honduras, but there was an express condition that they couldn't go to the military members who were pictured using them later. So, as I started this off, we might not sell a lot of weapons in this region, but we have 2 years ago an instance in which weapons the United States sold to Honduras were used to kill its own people. And I think all of us in this room can say, that doesn't sound very good. I think we can all agree that that's something that we should be uneasy about. We might not fully disagree with selling the weapons, but that's how you can kind of understand where the case that we're going to write, or we're going to argue, starts from. That the United States shouldn't be complicit selling weapons to a government that we can't trust they're not going to use it on their own people. So the case that we've constructed is an affirmative that actually uses language from Democratic House representatives, in which they argue, and this is an act that was put forward. So not only do we have the protests in 2017 in which citizens are killed, there are blatant human rights violations that have been occurring in Honduras for several years now. It actually had one of the highest homicide rates per capita in the world in 2011. It has blatant human rights abuses committed by people connected to the government. And a person to note is this woman named Berta Cáceres. She was an environmental activist who was fighting for an indigenous group in Honduras who was basically saying they were going to be forced off their land if this hydroelectric dam was built. And she was really fighting for their rights. She was murdered. Evidence has recently come out that the government was connected to this. And this isn't an isolated incident. There are a lot of people who have had their rights abused by people connected to the Honduran government. So the members of the House of Representatives put forward a bill called the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act. And I'll read the quote of the act that was actually put forward by U.S. representatives. The act is to suspend United States security assistance with Honduras until such time as human rights violations by Honduran security forces cease and their perpetrators are brought to justice. So, if we were to follow this resolution, this act put forward by members of the House of Representatives, that would mean we would end direct commercial sales and foreign military sales to Honduras until human rights abuses or human rights are no longer violated by people in the government or people connected to the government. So far, does this all make sense?
Yeah.
Do we have any questions? Let's stop right there. So the plan is, until Honduras basically meets thresholds for saying that they're a respectable democratic government that doesn't violate the rights of its citizens, we are ending arms sales. Okay, so let's stop there. Saw your hand first.
Okay, so you said the Monroe Doctrine is basically the Americas, right? The countries in the Americas. Are they allowed to leave?
So, okay, that's a good question. So the Monroe Doctrine is basically an informal thing that the United States said that, that the other countries don't have much say in. It's basically the United States' decision to tell other people they're doing this, and it's informal. So there have been questions over the years whether or not it even exists, whether or not it's true. It's one of those things that only exists when it's acted upon. So, for instance, let's say we had the Monroe Doctrine. So I made a speech in 1823 that says, we're protecting the Americas. And for 60 years, like England, France, Germany doesn't try to interfere in the United States, or in the Americas, excuse me. But then let's say in 1875 that, Spain tries to come and mess with Cuba. This is actually quite close. If we then said to Spain before they got there, like, get out, this is our turf, people would say, oh yes, the Monroe Doctrine is the reason, like, that's America's principle. So it's more of an idea rather than an actual, like, treaty or policy that we have firmly in place. Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit abstract, but that's kind of the idea. Okay, take a question back there.
Okay, so just to clarify, the Democratic person from Honduras that ran the first time,
yes,
wasn't allowed to run a second term.
Exactly, and again, we probably shouldn't use the word democratic. I'm just connecting that to left political ideology, like left-leaning, more socialist ideology is actually what is probably how we should describe it.
So he's more liberal.
Yeah, more liberal is like, so yeah, I think that liberal and conservative might be the best way. He actually is a socialist, so it's like actually okay. Unlike in the United States, like we wrestle with that a little bit more. He was a socialist, so it's okay to say that. But yes, so he was not allowed to run. So basically, you have issues in a lot of countries who have had dictators or strongmen in the past. So once they become more democratic, they'll create constitutions with safeguards in place to prevent someone from consolidating power again in the future. So Honduras has a constitutional provision that says you can only serve one 6-year term. And so Zelaya, basically said, like, I'm going to run again anyway, because the people were like, yeah, he's great, and they voted for him. But then there was a coup that the military tacitly supported by the United States was like, nope, you got to get out of here. You're not allowed to do this. And then in 2017, the exact same thing happened, except for the United States favored the other side that was staying in power. And again, more or less, the United States has kind of like kept a distance. In both cases, if the United States was more vocal, they could have tipped the balance of power either way.
So if the United States hadn't voted, hadn't backed up the conservative president running, he probably wouldn't have won.
Yes, he wouldn't have eventually come into power. It's very likely because this gentleman, Manuel Zelaya, the former president, would have just stayed in power. He would have won the presidential election and then had a 6-year term. Exactly. But at the time, it was under President Obama, and it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and they're the ones who were kind of okay with this. And so it's interesting, it kind of transcends the Obama-Trump presidencies as kind of supporting more the tacitly supporting the conservative side in Honduras. Okay, we're just going to do 2 more questions and then we're going to keep going. So we'll take a question there.
What's a coup?
A coup, very good question. So when someone is in power, you're a president, wait one second. if you're a president in power and you've been elected by the people, and sometimes actually not even elected by the people, a coup is when other powerful forces in the country come and remove you from office. So usually this happens with the military. So usually the president is political, right? Elected by the people. They have political coalitions with people who represent different parts of the country, and then the military is an institution that has weapons, has a broad base across the country, but they also have kind of political power in a different way. Sometimes what will happen is the military will say, we don't like what this person's doing, they're taking us in a bad direction, and they might even have the support of the people, and the military will come in and literally either take the president out of the country, sometimes they're executed, and then other times the president or the political figure knows the military is coming, does not want to die, and just hightails it out of the country, and then lives in exile from another country. Yeah, it's a complicated idea, but it's something that's, as you get older, is very, very, very important to understand in politics, because it sadly is the way a lot of countries end up getting destabilized, is you have someone who's democratically elected, and then you have military people who weren't democratically elected, but have a lot of power because they have the guns, forcibly remove someone from office. Okay, last question.
Okay, so you said that the U.S. sided with Honduras under Juan Orlando.
Yes.
So if the people knew that the U.S. sided with them, wouldn't the people of both sides, wouldn't they have caused a political retaliation?
So it's a good question, because that actually did happen in 2017, where the people saw this is blatantly corrupt, and that's why they took to the streets to protest. There were protests in 2009 as well, but there's only so much the United States can do, right? So the United States can sometimes be in what we would call a bind, right? They do one thing, it doesn't look good, and if they do another thing, it doesn't look good. So by not supporting the president, who had, he violated the Constitution by running again, if they had supported him, then people would be like, well, you're involving yourself in the politics of a different country to help someone do something that's unconstitutional. But if they don't do anything and they kind of say, yeah, it was unconstitutional, we'll let domestic politics play out, they also looked like the bad guys. So the United States was in kind of a lose-lose situation in 2009, if that makes sense. In 2017, I think it was more clear, but I don't want to inject my own bias into that. So I can always send information on that to let it speak for itself. But yeah. Okay, so we're going to get back to the case now, and then I'll get to questions. I'll give another session for questions, all right? So you can put your hand down. Okay, so again, the plan is to suspend United States security assistance with Honduras until such time as human rights violations by Honduran security forces cease and their perpetrators are brought to justice. You are going to have this case file. You're going to have that text all written out, so don't worry about it. That's what's important right now is to let the ideas sink in and kind of understand the general idea of what we're talking about. So the main idea is we're no longer going to send arms to Honduras until the security forces that commit human rights violations are ended. So the solvency is that what we're trying to solve for is ending U.S. complicity in the death of citizens. We have several U.S. House of Representative members who wrote an impassioned piece basically saying, enough is enough. We need to suspend all aid to Honduras until the human rights crisis in Honduras is fixed. So what we're arguing is that there are two advantages in this case. The first one is that ending arms sales to Honduras will decrease violence, and by decreasing violence, will also lower migration. We wanted to try to keep a familiar case because we did so much on immigration last year. You all got such good background on it, and you argued it so well that we wanted this case to have a little bit of familiarity. And what we talked about a lot last year is that when you have instability and when you have violence, people are likely to leave, right? You don't want to stay around if you're worried your government's going to kill you, or if you're worried that you're going to get killed by someone and the government's not going to do anything about it. So, the first part of the case is looking at how firearms are the leading cause of death in Central America. It's completely disproportionate. They have some of the highest rates of, it's approximately 75% of all homicides in Latin America are caused by firearms. The global average is 42%. So think about that disparity. And of course, we're not saying that every death by a firearm is the government killing someone, but if we're selling firearms to the government, if there's more weapons in circulation, if the government, as we saw in 2017, is in the public eye killing people with those firearms, we're recognizing there's a problem. And we don't want to continue to fuel that problem, right? So apparently, according to some statistics, in Honduras, that number jumps all the way up to 90%. So if Latin America is 75%, Honduras is even above that average. Think about that. The global average is 42%, okay? So one thing that the negative is going to try to argue is that actually quite positively, the homicides in Honduras have been going down. They were sky high though, in just several years ago. There were roughly 80 people murdered per 100,000 citizens in 2011. That dropped down to 42.8 in 2017. But by comparison, I want to say the United States is around like 4 per 100,000, because we can't compare total number of deaths, right? Because Honduras has a much smaller population than the United States. So if we looked at all homicides, you know, a country like China or India would obviously surpass everywhere else just because their populations are so big. I'll answer questions in a bit, okay? So the homicides have gone down, but you also have this really other troubling thing starting to happen. It's still very high. Let's make no mistake about that. 42.8 homicides per 100,000 in 2018 is still high. But another troubling thing is happening in Honduras, where you've had a lot of mass murders. So the argument that the negative is going to try to make is, look, things are getting better, which to a certain extent they are. But the affirmative is going to continue to emphasize we're very, very far from things being as good as we want them to be. And then, so we established at the beginning of the case that violence drives migration, firearm deaths are basically at a peak in Honduras. What we need to argue then is to create a link and say that violence drives migration. Now, we all know that that's a very common argument. So I have a few cards here for you to make that argument. But also, remember, if you have your case files from last year and you have any arguments about violence driving migration that you really liked, you're more than welcome to use those and bring those into the case, and we'll talk to David about integrating them in. Just talk to us, send if there's a card that you liked from last year that you felt really comfortable with, we can try to integrate it into this case because we want you all to be comfortable with this as well, all right? The next step that we have to link is that arms sales are spurring migration as well. There was an argument in 2019, someone wrote a paper talking about the impact of arms sales, small arms and ammunition is directly destabilizing poor Central American countries, leading to migration. The argument is that, one, we don't trust the government to not, the whole argument for us is that the government we can't trust them with human rights violations. What this argument also says is not only do we not trust them entirely, but that these weapons could be sold on the black market. Remember what I was saying earlier, not all homicides are at the hands of government guns, or of government officials, but they might be sold to people that they weren't supposed to be sold to. They might get into different parts of the army or military that weren't supposed to get those weapons. So what the argument's being made is, if there's no accountability of the Honduras government, if they're just acting however they want to act, why would we sell them weapons that could go anywhere? That could end up in the hands of criminals, that could end up in the hands of corrupt military forces. All of that is what is actually happening, and that's what's leading to migration. So this is also happening against the backdrop of another troubling issue, is that the Trump administration wants to cut aid to Central America. if we cut aid but increase arms sales, we're going in the opposite direction for both, right? We need to increase aid to help people and cut arms sales. But if we're just keeping arms sales and cutting aid, we're making a further destabilized situation. So, we also make the argument that this is actually kind of part of the plan for Central American governments. They don't mind letting excess people from their countries go. I don't know if you remember talking about this, but in last year, but there's not a huge effort on behalf of some of these corrupt Central American governments to really pull back the outward flow, because they're actually okay with not having extra people that they have to take care of. So we're basically encouraging the Honduran government to keep acting in a bad way that disrespects the rights of their citizens, that leads to migration, and there's no end in sight to any of it. So what we then argue is that if we don't stop something now, the immigration system's at a breaking point. If we keep having people come to the United States with the Trump administration not taking care of people at the border, we could have a full-blown humanitarian crisis. That could end up having ramifications for human life, for regional stability, all these different impacts that if you go and you read the cards, you'll see, and you can kind of choose, like, what do you think is the biggest impact? Is it the humanitarian issue? Is it the regional stability? All of these different things are basically at risk if we don't end arms sales, because we're just continuing to enable a corrupt regime that allows weapons to go to the wrong place, that ends up driving migration further, and the United States and the region as a whole basically pays the price, not to mention the individuals impacted and affected. Okay, so let's move to the next advantage. And then I'll ask questions afterwards to make sure we get this. So the next is human rights, and arguing that the United States has a innate need to promote democracy and human rights abroad. Because not only is it inherently good to promote human rights, but it's actually in the United States national security interest. This one is, so basically we have safeguards in place not to sell weapons to governments that violate human rights. We don't always follow that. What we're saying is we need to strengthen those safeguards and try to incentivize governments to act better. By acting better and showing that it's, by acting better, then people can get rewards. If a government is doing things correctly, we'll help them in terms of aid, we'll help them in terms of economic development, all these different things that can be beneficial for them, but we do it in a positive way. We try to say, look, we're not gonna give you these negative things, weapons, if you're acting bad. Let's try to help you adjust your behavior and the way you act, and in doing so, we'll welcome you with open arms, and we'll incorporate you into our orbit, essentially. And we'll really look after you, because the more you look after human rights, the bigger and deeper connection we want to have. The more you violate human rights, the more we're going to distance ourselves from you. Wait 1 second. So we essentially make the argument that it's in the United States national security interest to push for countries to not violate human rights, because not only are they not abusing people's rights, but then they become a stronger ally of ours. And the more people we have allied with us, with our ideology, strengthens the United States' position globally. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go over the neg, but I'll do 2 questions before we jump into.
Basically, so you're saying that if we cut off aid to Honduras and all the other countries that are destabilized, but we increase arms sales, we're just going to end up making people move out of their countries?
To a certain extent. So the way I like to think about it is okay, let's think about it up and down, right? So increasing arms sales is bad. So you're increasing the bad things. Increasing aid kind of pulls it back down, right? So you kind of meet in the middle. You create this balance. If you're cutting off aid, and you're increasing arms sales, it's both going in the same direction. Like bad things both continue to happen. So there's no what we call there's no counterbalance. So you want to try to balance these things out. If you're selling aid, at least try, or if you're selling weapons, at least try to provide enough aid to create an equilibrium to a certain extent. But if you're only selling weapons and you're cutting aid, you're creating conditions that are terrible for both the people in the country and essentially the United States in the long run as well. And we don't want that. We don't want this huge imbalance. But if we go the other way and we cut off arms sales and we work cooperatively, we can actually create the most ideal conditions. That's essentially what we're trying to go for, if that makes sense. One more question.
Also for Advantage 2, could we add, because like what you were talking about was kind of implying this, like if we focus on human rights, promote it, help them out with aid until just stop selling them arms until they increase with human rights, won't that also make us look better as a country? And not only will we have them as our allies, and we can also get more allies because we'll look like a strong, healthy, good country.
It's a very, very good question. I think you answered it in your question. What's the name of, what do we call that? No, it's great. I'm glad you asked it. What do we call that? There's a word, there's a term, soft power. Does everyone remember that term, soft power? It's exactly what, fantastic. So that's essentially what the second argument is making, is that soft power will incentivize not only Honduras to act better, which is great for the United States, but other countries as well. Very, very, very good point. Okay, so let's move on to the negative before we run out of time, and then we'll try to get to all the questions. So, two of the negative arguments are going to just directly attack on case. So you're going to try to undermine the link between arms sales and migration, and you're going to try to undermine the link between violence and migration, right? You all should be familiar with this line of argumentation from last year. And that's, again, why we wanted to have this in there, is you can say, look, violence doesn't drive migration. Economic factors, political stability, people's own personal desires, all these different things lead to migration. And actually, violence has been going down. Homicide rates have been going down in Honduras, yet immigration's been going up. So how do we explain that? The second argument on case we're going to argue is that the second argument that we're going to argue on case is that sorry, let me make sure I have it correctly. Is that Honduras is actually actively trying to reform its country. They're trying to reform the military. They're trying to do better. So they already understand they have a human rights issue, and basically ending arms sales isn't going to help that. So those are your two on-case arguments. The bigger argument is the case turn, the disadvantage, is that it's actually bad to cut off selling arms to Honduras. So you kind of make the argument in two ways. One, you say, look, we're not even selling that many arms. It's a small enough portion that we should continue doing this. It's completely fine. It's not like we're selling the amount of arms that we do to Saudi Arabia. We should keep doing this. In large part, because if we pull out of the region, someone else will move in. And in this case, the primary actor that we're saying will move in is China. So China has a great desire to increase its global reach, to increase its ability to have influence across the world. And one of the main ways countries gain influence, diplomatically, politically, is by forging economic ties. Selling weapons are really expensive, is a great way to foster trust between countries. I know that sounds kind of crazy, right? Like, I'm selling you weapons and that makes you trust me more. But you have to think about it in the way that if you're a small country and you're giving up a lot of your resources for weapons, if you actually get those weapons and then those weapons enhance your security, you can say, I actually trust this person, right? Like, if China's selling me these guns that I really need that I can't get elsewhere, I feel more secure as a country. They actually delivered on what I spend. That kind of opens up pathways for you to forge deeper bonds in other ways. And I know that sounds crazy, right? We normally think that, smaller levels of trade would be what you'd want. But as we've kind of seen in this trade war that the United States and China are waging, So Brazil China was getting soybeans from the United States. We create these, we have these sanctions, and then China just goes to Brazil, and their economic ties start getting bigger, right? If we do that on a larger scale with something that's more existentially important to them, such as weapons, that can forge bonds quite quickly. And that's a worry for the United States, because we don't want to be giving up what we would call leverage. Now, Honduras currently, so does anyone know the issue that that China, the Communist Chinese government of China has with Taiwan?
Yeah.
Can anyone quickly explain?
So just background, I know this because my family's kind of Taiwan, like from Taiwan. Taiwan wanted to pull out and become separate from China, and then riots started going down because China wanted to keep Taiwan. And I think at the moment they're separate.
Exactly. China sees Taiwan as part of China. Taiwan sees itself as separate. So internationally, you have different countries aligned with each country. Honduras is a country that recognizes Taiwan, and this is important because China is trying to influence Honduras to support them and not Taiwan, because in the long arc of history, what China is trying to do is to basically get Taiwan back. So Honduras, a couple countries in Latin America have recently switched their allegiance from Taiwan to China, and they have done that in large part because of economic incentives. On the negative, what you can argue is that if we pull out these arms sales from Honduras, China's going to not only move in with arms sales, but then, as I was saying to all of you, once you trust someone because of the economic relations, the political relations can then follow. And China can pull Honduras into its orbit. The United States does not want more countries in its backyard, as we started this conversation out with, aligned with China. It threatens us. So, what you're going to argue on the negative is that all these steps, you can see, if we pull out of Honduras and China works its way in, it gets in economically, it gets in politically, can eventually lead to an eventual clash between the two countries. If the United States and China were currently in a trade war, if we start worrying about security and threatening of the national security of either country, we could end up having a full-blown war. If the full-blown war happens, an all-out shooting war happens between the US and China, it would be a catastrophe for both countries and millions of people would die. So that's the ultimate impact you want to get to. And what you want to emphasize is that really worth it for this small amount of arms sales to Honduras, bringing it back to the beginning of this? So when you're trying to weigh out, on one side, on the affirmative, you're arguing essentially this human rights advantage that has distinct advantages for migration and national security, but is predicated on us not being complicit in the continual, perpetual cycle of these things happening, versus leading to a possible war with China. And those are the arguments you're going to have to make. On the affirmative, you say, look, war with China is not likely, and we need to care about the immediate human rights issues and how they bear on the United States in this present moment. So the affirmative is more of a short and medium term argument, and the negative, the disadvantaged case turn, is more of a long term argument, saying, look, this will eventually turn into something we can't control. Okay, I talked a lot, so I will stop there, and I will answer questions both about the case, more general questions you have, and all right, we'll start here in the middle. You've been so patient.
I have 2 questions.
Let's stick to one so everyone can get an answer, and we'll cycle back to your second question if we have time.
Okay.
So ask the one that's pressing, the one that's really getting at you.